To the military brass in the spring of 1945, the verdict was clear. A force of 100,000 men, the population of a mid-sized American city, had been sacrificed to a doctrine that failed. The experiment was over. Why did the U.S. Army build an entire branch of 100,000 soldiers for a concept that worked exactly as intended only once? The answer lay in the rubble of the Reich. An M36 Jackson crawls through a decimated German street. The clatter of steel treads on shattered brick echoes between hollow buildings. The crew isn't hunting panzer divisions. They are hunting a single machine gun nest. The commander spots a muzzle flash in a basement. He signals. The 90mm cannon roars at point-blank range, collapsing the structure into a cloud of gray dust. 100,000 men served a concept that worked exactly once. By the final months, German armor appeared in ones and twos. Tanks were out of fuel. They were dug into the earth as static pillboxes. The tank destroyers, designed for high-speed intercepts, spent their days clearing towns and supporting infantry. They were doing the job of regular tanks, but with thinner skin. Commanders reached a unanimous conclusion. They didn't want a specialized hunter, they wanted a real tank. The Jackson's 90mm gun was lethal, but it belonged on the M26 Pershing. The era of light, medium, and heavy designations was dying. The main battle tank was born. One vehicle to exploit breakthroughs, support the line, and kill anything in its path. The Army deactivated every single tank destroyer battalion within 1 year of the war's end. December 16, 1944. 3 German armies strike the Ardennes. 200,000 troops, 600 tanks. It was the massed armored breakthrough the doctrine had anticipated for years. This single instance, where machines followed the manual to the letter, occurred on December 16, 1944, near Bastogne. The town was athroat. 7 major roads met there. The Germans needed those roads to breathe. By December 21st, the 101st Airborne was encircled. Light infantry against heavy steel. They had bazookas, the Germans had panzers. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion received the call. They were 60 miles away. That is the distance from Washington to Baltimore. The M18 Hellcats covered it at maximum speed, a dead sprint to save the line. On Christmas Day, 18 panzers rolled into a trap. 4 Hellcats opened fire from the flanks. Crossfire. Minutes later, all 18 German tanks were burning wreckage. By the end of the siege, the 705th had traded 6 Hellcats for 40 German kills. If you ignore the desperate improvisations at Kasserine Pass, this was the only time the doctrine actually worked. One success in 4 years of war. A statistical anomaly in a sea of failure. The German tide didn't just test the doctrine, it crushed the parts that couldn't move. German spearheads overran the towed gun positions in hours. The breakthrough decimated the stationary battalions. While the light M18 Hellcats raced to save paratroopers in the Ardennes, a different breed of machine took shape in the rear. Engineers were descending into an industrial fever dream. Expectation, a cutting-edge breakthrough tank. Reality, a 90-ton turtle with a top speed of 8 miles per hour. Why did the Army need a 90-ton immobile monster? To punch through the concrete of the Siegfried Line. The T28 Super Heavy Tank was born from panic. Command feared the German fortifications would hold forever. They abandoned the doctrine of speed for the safety of raw mass. The vehicle carried a 105mm high-velocity gun in a fixed casemate. It was a rolling bunker designed to kill other bunkers. The mechanical cost was staggering. A 500-horsepower engine groaned under 95 tons of steel. The roar of the motor reached a breaking point just to move the tracks. To distribute the weight, engineers added 2 extra sets of treads. This turned the machine into a wide, unmanageable slab of iron. Initially designated as the T95 gun motor carriage, it was later renamed the T28. It represented the total inversion of American armored philosophy. The project stayed stateside as the war outpaced it. Infantry and standard Shermans breached the Siegfried Line before the monster could even reach the docks. The ultimate speed of this engineering agony was 8 miles per hour. The Siegfried Line and the neighboring Hürtgen Forest became the site where a fundamental design flaw began to systematically kill American crews. Forget the movies. The Hollywood image of constant tank-on-tank duels was a myth. By the time the Allies reached the German border, armor-on-armor combat had vanished into isolated skirmishes. Tank destroyers were no longer hunters. They were mobile artillery, grinding through the dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line. The accuracy of their long-range guns worked. They blasted pillboxes and concrete bunkers one by one. But the geography was shifting. The open fields of France were gone. Ahead lay the Hürtgen Forest. It was a vertical nightmare. The trees grew so thick that midday looked like twilight. Muddy logging trails turned into choke points. One stalled vehicle could paralyze an entire division. Then the tree bursts began. German mortar shells struck the dense upper canopy. Contact with the fir branches triggered the fuses 50 feet above the ground. A single shell didn't just explode. It transformed the forest into a vertical killing zone. Each round sent a shower of steel fragments and jagged wooden splinters straight down. Lead rain from a plywood sky. The open-top turret was designed for visibility. In the Hürtgen, it became a funnel for shrapnel. A shell detonates in the branches. Metal shards rip through the canopy. The jagged fragments fly downward into the exposed crew compartment. There was no roof to stop them. The forest floor echoed with the crack of breaking pine and the hiss of descending steel. Men inside the steel hulls were shredded by debris they couldn't even see. The perfect scouting machine had become a massive steel grave with an open lid. American command watched the casualty lists climb, but had no solution. They tried to engineer a breakthrough monster for these lines, but the project stalled in the mud. The United States failed to produce a single effective vehicle capable of piercing these defensive belts. The Siegfried Line and the Hürtgen Forest proved that the old guns were failing. To keep crews alive, the Army turned to a surgical, desperate modification, the M36 Jackson. How did the Americans find a solution so quickly? They didn't. The M36 existed on paper weeks before D-Day, but High Command shelved it. They believed the current guns would suffice. The Panther proved them wrong. The M36 was an emergency graft. Engineers took the proven M10A1 chassis and forced a massive new turret onto the hull. Inside sat the 90mm M3 gun. It was a weapon born for the sky. This was a heavy anti-aircraft gun, stripped down and adapted for ground slaughter. It represented a violent leap in mobile firepower. The power was undeniable. A 90mm shell could punch through a Panther's nose from 1,500 yards. To visualize the reach, the M36 later recorded a confirmed kill at 4,600 yards. That is more than the entire length of Central Park in New York. Production became a fever. When the M10 holes ran out, they bolted the new 90mm turrets onto M4A3 Sherman chassis. Anything to get the gun to the front. The turret remained open-topped, leaving crews exposed to the elements and shrapnel. But it finally featured power traverse. No more hand-cranked nightmares. No more losing the target because the motor couldn't keep up. The weapon was raw. Early models lacked a muzzle brake. One shot from the 90mm monster created a localized dust storm. The gunner was blinded for seconds as debris choked the air. Despite the grit and the blinding flash, the crews loved it. It was the only Allied vehicle that could hunt heavy German steel at a distance. The Jackson gave the tank destroyer branch a second lease on life. With the 90mm gun finally leading the way, the Allies pushed the Germans back and advanced through enemy territory. The panic-driven race for 90mm guns and heavy steel began with a single bone-chilling morning in Normandy, July 10th. The Panzer Lehr Division, the most elite ironclad formation in the German arsenal, swung its weight toward the village of Le Désert. 2 in the morning. Blackness. The ground shakes under the tracks of the Panther tanks. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion moves to intercept. This is the moment the doctrine was built for. The tank destroyers sprint into position to stop the breakthrough. Then, the math of war fails. An American gunner centers his sights on a Panther. Range, 1,000 yards. He pulls the trigger. The 3-inch armor-piercing shell screams through the air and strikes the frontal glacis. A shower of sparks. A piercing metallic shriek of hardened steel sliding off steel. The shell bounces. The Panther keeps coming. 800 yards. Another shot. Another ricochet. 500 yards. The shell deflects like a stone off a frozen pond. 200 yards. Point-blank range. The American round hits the 80mm plate, but the 55-degree slope effectively doubles the armor's thickness. The math is impossible. The American projectiles are useless. Panic grips the crews. They realize their primary weapon is a toy against the German front. Drivers slam into reverse. They desperately try to flank, clawing for a shot at the Panther's thinner side skin in the claustrophobic maze of Normandy. In 2 days of suicidal close-quarters combat, they trade blood for iron. They claim 12 Panthers, 1 Panzer IV, and a Stug. But the cost is staggering. Allied command watches the casualty reports with horror. The doctrine is dead. The brass looks for a miracle. They find it in tungsten core ammunition, the high-velocity armor-piercing round. On paper, it can punch through the Panther. In reality, it doesn't exist. Production is a trickle. Most tank destroyer crews fought from the beaches to the heart of the Reich without ever seeing more than 5 tungsten rounds. The Normandy landscape became a death trap that shredded the American tank destroyer doctrine. How do you fight using mobility when the battlefield is a cage 300 feet wide? You don't. The doctrine of open space maneuvers collapsed inside the labyrinth of the bocage. The M10 tracks ground through the grass, moving away from the beaches. The machine entered a small agricultural square. It was surrounded by 3-meter-high living walls. From the dense green hedge, a long muzzle of a Panther appeared. There was no room to turn, no room to run. In July 1944, the Allies faced approximately 400 Panthers in the narrow lanes of France. 40% of the German tank strength in Normandy consisted of these steel monsters. Their sloped frontal armor was a mathematical nightmare. At standard combat distances, the 3-inch guns of the M10 and the 76mm cannons of the Hellcat were effectively useless. British engineers worked in a fever. The air was filled with the metallic shriek of saws and the white glare of welding torches. They were desperate. They ripped open the turrets of Shermans and M10s to cram in the massive 17-pounder guns. These became the Fireflies and the Achilles. It was a frantic field modification to give crews a surviving chance against heavy German plating. The bocage turned the invasion into a series of claustrophobic duels. Every field was a patchwork of 300-foot kill zones. The dense hedges were reinforced by ancient stone walls and deep roots. They acted like natural bunkers. German infantry waited in the thickets. They clutched Panzerfausts and waited for the clatter of Allied tracks to grow loud. They prepared ambushes from every shadow, turning the lush greenery into a graveyard of burnt-out hulls. The Normandy slaughter was the direct result of a structural death sentence. Open-topped turrets turned American crews into literal targets for shrapnel. A steel roof was the only thing standing between a soldier and a jagged piece of hot iron. On the M10 and M18, that roof didn't exist. German artillerymen exploited this. They utilized time fuses. They set shells to detonate exactly 10 meters above the ground. A standard tank shrugs off an airburst. In an open turret, the same explosion turns the fighting compartment into a lead-filled bowl. The physics were lethal. A shell bursting overhead increased the shrapnel kill radius by 500% compared to a ground impact. Fragments rained vertically. No angle was safe. One driver, nicknamed Jonah, survived the total destruction of 3 consecutive turret crews. The 4th replacement team refused to board. They believed he was cursed. He wasn't cursed. He was just the only man under a roof. How did the crews fight back? They didn't wait for a redesign. They improvised. Men piled sandbags over their heads. They strapped logs across the gaps. Some cut steel plates from wrecked German Panzers and welded them onto their own turrets. It was a desperate frontline hack to fix a boardroom oversight. The environment was the second killer. The winter of 1944 was the coldest Northern Europe had seen in 40 years. These machines used radial engines. To stay cool, the engines sucked air directly through the crew compartment. The fighting hole became a high-speed wind tunnel. Inside, the temperature dropped until the metal bit through gloves. The sound was a constant, freezing howl. Icy air was vacuumed past the men's necks by the 400-horsepower motor. Soldiers called the M10 a large armored refrigerator. High command saw the data. The doctrine was hemorrhaging men. Official folding steel roof kits finally went into production. They reached the front 3 months after the war ended. It was too late. Commanders across the European theater began a formal push to dissolve the tank-destroyer branch entirely. The machine that pushed the doctrine of zero protection to its absolute limit was the M18 Hellcat. It became the fastest tracked vehicle of the Second World War. Engineers built it from the ground up. No repurposed chassis, no heavy steel plates. They installed a 400-horsepower radial engine and a Torque-matic automatic transmission. This combination pushed 18 tons of metal to 55 miles per hour. Why did they sacrifice the lives of the crews? For that record-breaking speed. That 55-mile-per-hour mark would stand unbeaten until the arrival of the M1 Abrams in the 1980s. The technical trade-off was brutal. The M18 featured an open-topped turret and armor only half an inch thick. On the front lines, this translated to a death sentence. Standard German MG-42 machine guns could shred the hull at close range with armor-piercing rounds. The firepower was the only compensation. A new 76mm gun sat in a power traverse turret. A veteran crew could cycle 20 rounds in a single minute. The tactic was simple. Sprint in, unleash a storm of shells, and vanish before the enemy could traverse their sights. The transition was not easy. When the Hellcats arrived in Italy, crews accustomed to the M10 refused to switch. They looked at the paper-thin hull and saw a coffin. Some units staged outright protests against the new machines. Fear eventually gave way to the thrill of the throttle. Drivers grew addicted to the agility and the ease of the automatic shifters. They learned to rely on the torsion bar suspension to outrun what they couldn't survive. But the fundamental flaw remained. They had no armor. The diagnosis for this failing doctrine arrived earlier than expected. The mountains of Sicily broke the cabinet blueprints. Pentagon theorists envisioned vast tank battles on open plains. Instead, they got narrow Italian valleys and tight stone streets. The landscape killed the spearhead. No massive German panzer wedges appeared. The weapon built to hunt tanks found no prey. Command made a choice. They forced the M10 into a surrogate role. The tank destroyer became a makeshift assault gun. It worked as mobile artillery, supporting infantry in the rocks. The crews adjusted the racks. A heavy clack of the breech echoed as they shoved a high-explosive shell into a barrel designed for armor piercing. The irony was lethal. The M10's 76mm high-explosive round contained nearly half the bursting charge of a standard Sherman shell. But they used what they had. The M10 acted like a real tank, but without the protection. It had the thin skin of a Scout and the open roof of a convertible. Rain and shrapnel fell straight onto the loaders. When a Panzer III or IV did emerge, the 3-inch gun was surgical. It was reliable. It was accurate. But those moments were rare. Most days, the crews simply waited for targets that never came. They spent the campaign firing weak explosives at bunkers and stone walls. The math of the Sicilian hills was simple. 10 high-explosive shells for every 1 armor-piercing round. The high-explosive math of the Sicilian hills was a warning. But command ignored the red flag since Operation Torch. In North Africa, the tank destroyer concept first choked on its own blood. The M10 was missing. It wasn't ready for the invasion. Instead, the U.S. Army sent Frankensteins, makeshift gun motor carriages. These were thin-skinned trucks with cannons bolted to their backs. At Kasserine Pass, the theory met the desert. The crews followed the manual. They advanced aggressively. No armor, no cover, just speed and a prayer. They ran straight into the 10th Panzer Division. These were veterans. They had been perfecting mobile slaughter since the invasion of Poland in 1939. What was the real price of the tactical success at El Guitar? 72 casualties in a single engagement. The Americans spotted the German spearhead. The gun motor carriages roared into position at full speed. They attempted the hit-and-run doctrine they had practiced in Texas. The Germans didn't blink. They were dug in. A single volley of German steel turned the American line into a graveyard. The 37mm guns were toys. Their shells bounced off German medium tanks like pebbles. The crews realized too late. They were sitting in open-top targets. 1 month later, at El Guitar, the math stayed brutal. The Americans claimed 30 German tanks. But look at the sand. 21 destroyed gun motor carriages lay smoldering in the heat. To kill 30 panzers, the U.S. sacrificed nearly an entire battalion's worth of men. The M10 finally arrived as the North African campaign ended, but the ratio was already set. 1 German tank for 2 American lives. The problem was not the engineering. The failure lay in the technical requirements for the M10. An attempt to graft a 2,000-pound gun onto a light chassis produced a mechanical disaster. Weight distribution dictated every move. The 3-inch gun sat at the very front of the turret. Gravity pulled the barrel down, making the entire assembly severely front-heavy. To fix the imbalance, engineers bolted 2,500 pounds of lead counterweights to the rear. The turret was a trap. A soldier gripped the manual hand crank, muscles straining against the steel. He turned the wheel desperately, but the heavy gun moved with agonizing slowness. A full 360-degree rotation took 80 seconds. By contrast, a standard Sherman could swing its turret in 18 seconds. 80 seconds of cranking meant the M10 was a sitting duck. In that time, a German Panzer IV could fire 10 aimed shots. Engineers stripped the armor to save weight, but the counterweights took it all back. The M10 ended up only 3 tons lighter than a Sherman. Side protection dropped to 19 millimeters, half of the original tank. Even a 20mm anti-aircraft gun could shred its hull. The doctrine promised a silent, invisible hunter. The reality was a roaring engine. Unlike the Sherman, the M10 lacked an auxiliary generator to charge batteries. To keep the radios and sights powered, the crew had to run the massive main engine. The ambush was over before it began. Instead of a silent predator, the Americans delivered a loud, vibrating target to the front lines. Confusion often follows the names. The British took the M10 through Lend-Lease and installed their 17-pounder gun. They called it the Achilles. The Wolverine nickname was a post-war invention. During the conflict, the crews simply called it a death trap. Sacrificing the armor of a battle-tested tank yielded almost nothing. The M10's top speed was only 5 miles per hour higher than a standard Sherman. To gain those extra 5 miles per hour, designers subjected the Sherman chassis to radical surgery. They didn't just tweak it, they stripped it. The goal was a purpose-built Predator, the M10 tank destroyer. Engineers took the reliable M4 base and began removing protection to save weight. They added an open-top turret, no roof, no overhead cover. Why strip armor from a functional tank? To serve a blind faith in the first-look concept. Doctrine dictated that whoever spotted the enemy first won the duel. Visibility became more important than survival. While German tank destroyers used fixed hulls, the Americans demanded a rotating turret. Inside that turret sat a 3-inch gun. It wasn't a modern miracle. It was a derivative of a World War I-era anti-aircraft weapon, a Great War relic repurposed to hunt panzers. The machine was a collection of contradictions. The upper front hull plate was 38 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees. This was actually thinner than the base Sherman's 51 millimeter plate. But the real death trap was on the flanks. 19 millimeters. That was the thickness of the side armor. A German 20mm flak 38 autocannon could punch through it at distance. It wasn't tank armor. It was a thin steel skin. Despite these flaws, the Pentagon bet everything on the machine. The M10 project received a higher national production priority than the Sherman tank itself. The Pentagon's gamble on the M10 grew from a foundation of pure desperation. Before the first purpose-built destroyers reached the front, the Camp Hood assembly line in Texas churned out crews for machines that defied military logic. These were the Frankensteins of the motor pool. hybrids born from spare parts and panic. Take the M6 gun motor carriage. It was a 3/4-ton truck with a 37mm cannon bolted to the bed. There was one fatal flaw: it could not fire forward. When testers tried, the muzzle blast shattered the windshield into 1,000 shards. The shockwave nearly killed the driver. The solution was absurd. Designers turned the gun around. To engage the enemy, the M6 had to literally back into its firing position. A light truck, reversing toward Tiger tanks at 5 miles per hour. It cost just over $4,000. It was the cheapest tank destroyer of the war, and it showed. The madness didn't stop at trucks. As the 37mm gun became obsolete, the Army scavenged First World War-era 75mm cannons. They bolted these relics onto M3 half-tracks. They added thin steel plates to the front to stop rifle fire, but left the sides and back completely exposed. The crew had no more protection than a man standing behind a fence. Camp Hood became a factory for these suicide squads. The base sprawled across 158,000 acres of Texas scrubland. It was a massive conveyor belt, training thousands of men to hunt panzers in vehicles that were never meant for combat. Commanders practiced shoot and scoot tactics, but the reality was simpler. They were mass-producing targets. The experiment ended in the sands of North Africa. After the Tunisia campaign, the Army saw the M6 for what it was: a liability. Most surviving units were stripped of their guns and converted back into cargo trucks. The crews of the M3 and M6 were not sent to their deaths because of a steel shortage. They were sacrifices to a paper doctrine. How to stop a blitzkrieg? American planners decided to build an armored fire department. The logic was purely financial. A single medium tank cost $35,000. To the accountants in Washington, using such an expensive machine to kill another tank was a waste of resources. They believed a cheap gun could do the same job for a fraction of the price. The strategy looked perfect on a map. While the main force held the line, specialized tank destroyer battalions waited in reserve. When German panzers punched through, these fire trucks would racing to the breach. Imagine the ideal ambush. Lightweight machines sprint from the woods. They catch the enemy flank. They fire, kill, and vanish before the German turrets can even rotate. The brass called this shoot and scoot. They even gave the men a symbol of this predatory speed. It was a shoulder patch showing a Black Panther, stitched in black thread, crushing an enemy tank in its jaws. Because they relied on speed, armor was deemed a luxury. The doctrine stated they only needed to stop rifle bullets and shrapnel. Anything heavier was irrelevant. If you were hit, you had already failed the doctrine. In the 1940s, this was the ultimate budget-friendly war. A cheap gun, a fast engine, and a crew whose lives had no place on the balance sheet. Before the first shot was fired in Europe, the Army held massive field maneuvers to prove the concept. They rigged the rules. Umpires gave the tank destroyers impossible advantages, ignoring the chaos of real mud and real panic. The planners celebrated. They had created a perfect solution for a war that only existed on their drafting tables. To ensure the correct results, the observers implemented artificial rules during the final field tests. The suicidal doctrine of shoot and scoot didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was born from a cold, existential terror of the German armored spearheads. In 1940, American observers watched the map of Europe dissolve. They didn't just see tanks, they saw a revolution. The Wehrmacht discarded the old rules. They concentrated their panzers into narrow, violent wedges. These spearheads didn't crawl with the infantry. They punched through defensive lines or simply drove around them. Speed was their armor. What happened to the defenders? They vanished in the dust. Thick clouds of grit rose as German tracks bypassed every static strongpoint. The Americans realized their entire defensive manual was obsolete. Could a 37mm towed anti-tank gun stop a blitzkrieg? No, it was a toy. The weapon was too heavy to move quickly and too weak to matter. By the time the crew unhitched the carriage, the panzers were already in their rear. Rommel would later turn this into an art form in North Africa. Decisive, aggressive charges left American gunners surrounded or crushed under metal. The crisis was systemic. During the interwar period, the United States simply did not prioritize tank development. The War Department clung to a rigid, outdated belief. They insisted that tanks existed only to support the infantry. Fighting other tanks was someone else's job, but there was no one else. The United States entered the era of mechanized slaughter with empty hands and a 37mm gun. The Army had ignored the evolution of the tank for 20 years. The American Army entered the war with a Ghost Branch, a specialized force born from terror, not logic. By 1945, the experiment ended in total liquidation. The Pentagon disbanded every single tank destroyer battalion. They scrapped the doctrine. They buried the idea. Where did this systemic error take root? In the moment of watching the collapse of Europe. The panic started in 1940. American planners watched the French Army, the strongest force on the continent, vanish in 46 days. The Wehrmacht didn't just win, they annihilated. This unprecedented speed shattered the nerves of the War Department. They saw French steel shatter under German maneuver. The shock wasn't the defeat itself, it was the pace. Armor moved like a tide, bypassing every fixed defense. To the Americans, the traditional anti-tank gun was now a tombstone. They needed a mobile fire brigade. They needed a weapon to chase the blitzkrieg. This existential fear of Rommel's armored spearheads birthed a suicide tactic. It was an emergency response to a trauma that lasted less than 7 weeks. The result was a branch of service designed for a war that no longer existed. The Army eventually pulled the plug on the entire project.